Welcome to Tough Questions. In this film today, we're going to be looking at the issue of, is it okay for a Christian to go to war? So can a Christian be a member of the armed forces? And can one Christian country go to war against another? Now, as in the film on abortion, we began with the sixth commandment, do not commit murder. And unfortunately, every war and battle that has ever been fought results in deaths and casualties on both sides. Then, of course, there is the example of Jesus, who was a radical peacemaker. And he taught again and again that we are to be peacemakers. Now, it's worth saying that as with the issues around abortion, these ethical problems need to be looked at when they don't affect us, i.e. they need to be looked at in times of peace, not when we as a country are engaged in active conflict. They need to be considered before the issue becomes urgent for us. But with war, there is something else that we need to look at, and that is that our world is changing and developing. And as we have changed and developed, the way that we engage in war has also dramatically changed and developed. Therefore, this is an issue that needs constant revisitation as our world develops and changes. Indeed, it could be argued that what was appropriate for Christians 100 or 1,000 years ago is no longer appropriate today and won't be appropriate in 100 or 1,000 years' time. Now, Christian thinking on this issue has broadly been grouped into three areas, which I think are helpful when we're looking at this issue. First of all, pacifism, secondly, Crusades, and finally, just war theory. Christian pacifists look primarily to the example of Jesus and see him as the ultimate pacifist. Despite his overturning the tables of the money changers and his claim that he came to bring a sword, Jesus' teaching on peace was a central theme of his message. He was the Prince of Peace, and he gave his disciples the gift of peace and told them they were blessed when they practiced peace. The theory is that there is never a reason to go to war or to initiate violence, quite the opposite. Instead, the only way to fight against violence is by peaceful means, even if it means giving up your own life for the cause, just as Jesus did. And of course, there have been some dramatic examples of people dying in the midst of peaceful protest. One of the best examples of a pacifist is that of Mahatma Gandhi, who in his campaign against the British rule in India. But there are some difficulties in holding this position. Firstly, it's not very practical. To say that it is not justified to kill one person in order to save 100 of other lives is not a stance that many people could agree with. And indeed, the Christian faith says that Jesus allowed himself to be killed in order to save the rest of humanity. Secondly, whilst pacifism tells us what not to do, i.e. not to go to war or to engage in violence, it doesn't tell us what to do instead. We still live in a world where groups of people oppress others, and Jesus teaches us to be concerned for those who are oppressed. How are we to stop oppression? Thirdly, pacifism assumes that the oppressor has a conscience. You see, if somebody refuses to fight with violence and only displays peace, it will only have an effect on the opposite if they have a conscience. If they don't have a conscience, they'll just destroy the peacemaker. But this is not to say that pacifism doesn't work, because actually pacifists play an important role in the Christian thinking on war. Some Christian pacifists claim that to be so is a specific calling from God and not necessarily for everybody. But this calling allows them to raise the moral bar for the rest of us and also demonstrates the way of the kingdom of God to which we are all working towards. Regardless of that, pacifists contribute to the debate on Christian thinking around war and peace in three really important ways. Firstly, they speak really loudly on the issue. And so they keep it in the forefronts of our minds, and they keep it on the political agenda of the country in which they live. And as I said earlier, this debate is an ongoing debate, and so it's important to have people speaking on every side of the issue. But most importantly, pacifists speak very loudly about the dreadful thing that war actually is, and the terrible deaths and the terrible atrocities that occur during war. They keep those things to the forefront of our mind. When we speak of crusades in a Christian context, people are automatically drawn to the Crusade wars in the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, where Christians fought to reclaim Jerusalem from Islamic occupation. And this is a really good example. The definition of a crusade is a holy war, i.e. it's a war that is totally justified because you believe you're fighting for God. Therefore, no other reason or justification is required. Anything goes because you are fighting on the side of good. You're fighting on God's side. And the people that you're fighting against, well, it doesn't matter what happens to them because they're spiritually doomed anyway. The battle is fought on behalf of God in a crusade, and the casualties and the methods of fighting are secondary considerations. I think it's safe to say that the Christian crusades that I have just spoken about are now widely considered as a horrific example of how religion can be used to justify terrible acts of unnecessary violence. And far from being a holy war, from being what God wants, they are the exact opposite of how a Christian should act. But it's very easy for us, isn't it, to look back to a time gone by in history and condemn those actions as being the actions that people did years ago when they didn't know as well as we know now, and to believe that today somehow we know better, because crusades still happen today. We still have examples of where one group of people believe that their morals or their religion or their ethics should be the prevailing one, and so they invade another country in order to establish what they consider as something better. This is where we get ethnic cleansing and countries where religion is not a choice but an obligation. It also happens when Western countries defend invading poorer countries, saying that they are bringing a more advanced culture or values such as democracy or the free market. Just war theory takes a more pragmatic view. It suggests that war is inevitable and there will always be conflicts, and so it seeks to create boundaries that say that under specific circumstances, it's okay and it's right to go to war. Some people would even argue that war is an essential evil or a necessary evil to prevent the oppression of a group of people by a stronger force. In fact, to go to war could be considered as an act of love towards a group of people who are being oppressed. Now, before we look at what these boundaries are, it's important to understand that just war theory is based on the notion that war is wrong and should be avoided at all costs. So let's look at some of these boundaries. Firstly, we do not initiate war. We only ever respond to another group or country's act of aggression. So we don't aim to enlarge our territories by invading someone else's land, and we don't try to enforce our beliefs or our way of living onto another country or group of people. However, when we see other countries or other groups of people doing this, we step in to take action. Secondly, we do everything possible to pursue a resolution to conflict through peaceful means, whilst also keeping the threat of war a possibility. This means that any opposition was fully informed of the likely consequences of their actions. Thirdly, we only go to war if we have a good, reasonable chance of winning. Otherwise, we just risk losing many, many lives with no eventual possibility of a good result. Fourthly, the war itself must be proportional. The amount of force used must be the minimum amount required to achieve the aim as quickly as possible. It's not okay to totally annihilate a country and kill every person living there. Just the right amount of force is needed to end the oppression. Fifthly, it's incredibly important to, as much as possible, safeguard the lives of the innocent. Killing innocent people defeats the object of going to war to save the oppressed in the first place. Sixthly, the way we conduct war and how we treat our enemies, especially prisoners of war, is important. A just war must be conducted justly. Seventh, the good that we hope to achieve must significantly outweigh the current evil that is being caused. And finally, the eventual aim of the war is to make peace, not to step in and replace one set of oppressors by becoming oppressors ourselves. Now, of course, there are problems with just war theory. The most obvious being, who gets to decide what is the moral code for the world? Just because one country believes another country is being oppressive does not give them the right to take the moral high ground. And what happens when both sides believe that they are acting for justice? You see, in our world, we don't have a world police force or a code of conduct to which every country has signed up to. Now, yes, of course, there is the United Nations, which can be argued is the closest that we have ever got to this. And many Christians support the Geneva Protocols, such as the one banning biological weapons in 1925, and the Hague and the Nuremberg legal traditions, and the International Red Cross. Such things are helpful because they don't rely on one country or one group of people to state what is right. And what about the use of nuclear weapons, or the development of them as deterrents? How this issue fits into just war theory is complex and difficult. So let's go back to the example of Jesus. We see that he encouraged us to be peacemakers. Yes, he used violence when necessary, but on a daily basis, Jesus walked peace wherever he went. This is something that each of us should be practicing in our lives. Being peacemakers is not just for the United Nations. We don't have to carry guns to be peacemakers. As a Christian, we cannot claim to be a pacifist or believe in just war theory if in our own lives we don't pursue what builds up for peace. I'm talking here about conflict within our families or between our work colleagues or our neighbours. This should be a primary area of focus for us. Consider the words that we speak when we talk about those people that we don't really get on with. Are we speaking well or ill of them? Do we reach out to help our enemies in our own lives, or are we glad when they come to harm? How do we consider people who are different from ourselves, who have different cultures, skin colours and backgrounds? Are we welcoming the refugee into our community as they flee from war in another place? It's one thing for us to demand that our government always pursues peaceful ends to oppression, but then to dislike it when an oppressed person seeks refuge in our country. Peace starts with us, not with our politicians or our country leaders. Peace has to start in the depth of the Christian heart and be displayed in our own lives and actions.